Hello my fellow Tamrielites, welcome to the channel, or welcome back. During the Scholarium questline, a lot of NPCs point out that the origins of the Luminaries are quite mysterious. So today we are going to examine that mystery and ask a lot of questions. I've been looking forward to doing this particular video for months, and I am very happy to finally be getting to it. However, since I am dedicated to bringing you a spoiler-free lore experience, before I dive in, here's a list of plots I'll be ruining. First, the prologues for both Necrom and Gold Road, as well as the Necrom and Gold Road zone stories themselves. Also the Infinite Archive quest, the Mages Guild questline, and of course, all 6 quests from the Scholarium. Secondly, I need to mention that although it may not look like it, yes, this is the third in a series of lore videos about the new Ithelia lore and storyline, and I will be building on material from previous videos. I'll sum up when necessary for those of you who haven't seen them, but I'll be trying to repeat as little as possible for those who have. I'll put a card on the screen here that links to Part 1, and links to both Part 1 and Part 2 will be in the description. And with all that fine print out of the way, my friends, let's finally do a lore dive. We begin our adventure with Adept Ernard here, who tells us members of the Mages Guild Martial Force, the Knights of the Lamp, have discovered an anomaly while patrolling. Ernard asks us to assist the lead knight, whose name is Nalia. I do love me a good anomaly, so I'm all over that, and off we go to Sunamir. Sunamir, we are told, is an ancient First-Era Altmeri library built far before the founding of the Mages Guild. I thought a timeline might be helpful here, but don't worry, there will not be a test. We'll do broad strokes first. It was First Era 243 when Alessia, Morahas, Pelinal, and the rebel forces took the White Gold Tower and founded the Empire. I'll bet that was a fun celebration party. And the First Era officially ends in 2920 with the assassination of Emperor Remen-Cyrdail III, the last direct Alessian descendant. The Ruby Throne is then taken by Remen's advisor, Potentate Versidue Shay, a vampiric Akviri snake man. End the First Era, and the calendar began again with year 1 of the Second Era. It was also Potentate Snakeboy who granted Vanus Scholarian a charter to found the Mages Guild in 2E230. The Second Era is the sitting for ESO, which is about year 580-something. Plenty of other stuff happens in the Second Era, but the Scholarium questline refers back to the First Era events, so with that context, let's look a bit closer at that part of the timeline, focusing first on Imperial, Ayleid, and Ithelian lore. It was 1E361 that the Alessian Empire outlawed Ayleid lordships, meaning they could no longer hold land or positions of power past that point. We learn in the Westweald Zone story that the last great Ayleid city, Miskarkand, was abandoned about this time, with its citizens drifting away from the city in small groups to assimilate into Valenwood Bosmer society. That drifting away began in the mid-300s and lasted until the late 400s. By First Era 500, they are all but gone as a distinct people. If citizens started abandoning Miskarkand in the mid-300s, then I think there's a case to be made that Ithelia might have been imprisoned by Mora sometime between the late 200s and 350. It seems odd that the Ayleids just drifted away from Miskarkand like that. But if it held an important shrine of Ithelia's, then after her disappearance, the citizens wouldn't have been as motivated to hold on to it. So that's one guess about when that might have happened. However, there's a book in the Scholarium that gives a fascinating look at the late Ayleid period. Remember the last Ayleid king that we rescue in the main Cold Harbor story, King Dinar? In the Scholarium we find notes he has written in preparation for a biography, and it provides a chronological accounting of his family's loss of power, beginning with year 263 in the line, "My father humiliated by the Empress." The entry for year 453 to 460 also includes notes about Hermaeus Mora cults, strange rites, and persistent visions. One might make a case that those entries are evidence that Ithelia was imprisoned in the mid to late 400s. So I'm guessing the range is about 1E290 to 490. Let me know if you have a reason to disagree. As you'll see, a lot of my Scholarium speculation depends on the Ithelia timeline, so I'm curious about how other people feel about this date. We know Ithelia was definitely imprisoned before First Era 700, because we see in the Gold Road prologue quest that the good Daedra of the Velothi people were still in power when that happened, and it's 1E700 when we have the Battle of Red Mountain, the Dragon Break, and the totally legit rise of the Tribunal over the good Daedra. The dwarves disappear, the Chimer become the Dunmer, and Nerevar lives happily ever after. With that context, let's fill in the relevant Magi side of our history. Shalidor settled into his island sanctuary of Eyevea pretty early in the First Era, long before he built the Labyrinthian. Originally it was his own private place, and later he was joined by Ulfsild, who then created the Scholarium under the Meng Sanctuary. I may have missed it, but I didn't see anything to give me a clue as to when she began her renovations and expansions, however. We'll discuss that more later. We're also a little fuzzy on when exactly Shalidor built the Labyrinthian, but it was sometime between 1E370 and 500. A lot happened around then, right? Part of the prize for making it out of the Labyrinthian alive was the ability to study with Shal on his private island sanctuary, so after it was stocked with monsters, a few surviving cool kid mages eventually came to Eyevea as well. They all happily studied away for about 2,000 years until the 23rd century of the First Era, when Shalidor made his wager with Sheogorath and Eyevea changed zip codes to 999 Crazyland. And that's our background for the First Era. Whether you're grateful I did the timeline or you're grateful I'm done, maybe consider hitting the like or subscribe button while I take a breath and mourn for all of the cool things I could not put on the timeline. Tragic. And now let us return to Ernard, who still has that portal waiting. We meet the other Knights of the Lamp, then with Nalia we make our way through the bowels of the Sunamir complex. Right about the time Nalia says,
"All these defenses are meant to protect what?"
We see a statue of Meridia. Meridia is not worshipped by the Altmer. You might remember a point in the Somerset quest when Roz suggests you go talk to a contact of his who happens to be a Meridia worshipper, and he takes pains to explain that she's a good person anyway, even though worshipping Daedra is basically a death penalty offense. We know we are in the caverns under Eyevea, which was once an island off the coast of Somerset. We also know Shalidor got the island for a pittance because the Altmer didn't consider it to be of value. And we know that although Ulfsild did extensive construction, some areas predate her. To quote part 4 of our story, "I opened a portal to Eyevea, or at least I thought I had. I emerged in complete darkness. I could feel masses of magicka like the sun somewhere far above me, so I began to climb through the caverns, which gave way to cleared ruins of a bygone age. I had made it to Eyevea, only far beneath it." First, I ask if the Altmer who traded Eyevea to Shalidor even knew the ruins were there, being buried so far under the surface. Then I want to know why they were buried. Then I want to know exactly what Ulfsild meant when she wrote that she felt masses of magicka above her. As I wonder who really built the original core structures of the Scholarium, I keep thinking about the Durrani Tower. So let's chat about that a minute. ESO's current new character starter tutorial, a quest called the Gates of Adamant, was added to the game with the Somerset chapter. Our baby toon arrives in the Durrani Tower along with an explosion and a Daedra attack. When our guide, Norianwe, takes us to a place known as the Keyrights Gallery, she is shocked to find that the explosion revealed a previously unknown power source, which in turn fired up an array of portals the player can use. House Durrani spent centuries studying the tower, but they didn't know about this secret power source or how to turn on the portals. They did, however, know the room contained portals. Norianwe doesn't explain how they knew, but she is clear that they tried to activate the gates and hadn't been able to. The explosion in Durrani Tower during the tutorial revealed the room's purpose, powered up the gates, and it happened coincidentally when the player character showed up. Almost like fate.
Well, fate's sort of a clumsy way to put it. No offense. Honestly, we may never know why you were chosen. But I believe there was intention here. Something, whether it be the stars, the gallery, or the tower itself, placed you here for a reason.
This might be a stretch, but I believe we aren't the only ones who got placed in a location for a reason by some force unknown. Ulfsild told us she thought she opened a portal to Eyevea, but ended up far, far beneath it. It is not wise to portal to a place that you've never been before, but Ulfsild was a great mage and extensively researched her target. It sounds like it's possible some force intentionally redirected her to land not only below ground, but to an open safe space underground and not into solid rock. I've been calling the tower in the tutorial the Durrani Tower, but that's just its current name because House Durrani controls it. Before it was the Durrani Tower, it was the Balfiera Tower, and before that, Adamantia, the Adamant Tower. The White Gold Tower in Cyrodiil is probably the first tower most players think of when they hear the word, and arguably the primary one in the current paradigm. But the Adamant Tower was the first tower ever made. Extending as far below ground as above, it's the oldest structure in Tamriel, designed by Magnus and built by the Aedra. Magnus, the first to abandon the project and flee Mundus, followed by the Magna Ge. Now, I am not trying to say that Magnus had a hand in creating the old structure under Eyevea that Ulfsild grew into the Scholarium. I do think, however, that we have enough to assume the Altmer did not build the old ruins, they were just the one who passed the island to Shalidor. This place is really very extremely seriously old.
Voice of Magnus, where are we?
While Ulfsild's wards held remarkably well, over the centuries the magic flowing from the doors in the main hall to the altar destabilized and became dangerously volatile. The first order of business is to break those links. Then Nalia attempts to close the circuit entirely by destroying the focus crystal on the altar, which is not the approach I would have taken. And in fact, not the approach she should have taken, and the Scholarium's caretaker scolds us for it.
Meddlers! Thieves! What have you done to my altar?
To stabilize the broken altar, we have to replace the crystal Nalia smashed, and then use the altar to scribe a spell. After we have scribed our first spell, the crow lays out the path necessary to follow in the footsteps of scribing's creator, Ulfsild. So begins a series of trials posed by a group of powerful magical beings Ulfsild called the Luminaries. It is the power of the Luminaries that allows the scribing altar to function, and without their support, a mage cannot use the altar. I hope no one minds if I seriously shorthand this next part. We must begin our scribing journey with the Indrik, the oldest of the Luminaries. He offers us a chance to perform trials and complete a quest, and when those are finished, he agrees to support our efforts and empower the scribing altar. This process then repeats with the Netch, Gryphon, and Dragon in no particular order. Each have a different approach and a different kind of quest. Before we can meet with each of them, however, including the Indrik, we have to find them. The clues to finding them are hidden in their 4 fables. Ulfsild collected as many versions of the fables as she could, all of the ones that she could see contained power, and by comparing them was able to track the beings described and access their otherworldly realms. This was possible because Ulfsild had the ability to actually see magic, like rivers of power flowing across Nirn. Ulfsild believed that her ability was a gift from Magnus himself. To her, magic was not a series of formulas, but a more creative, intuitive process. She could manipulate and work with magic in a way that no one else could, and her dream was to enable other mages to see what she saw. She developed her true sight lens both as a tool to refine her sight and as a way to allow others to use her gift. That gift allowed her to find the Luminaries, and we are able to use her true sight lens to follow in her footsteps. Finding the keys, doorways, and indeed the Luminaries themselves is always our first step in winning their friendship in the quests. Once we are present in each of their realms, the next step is to place their magic-infused fable on a dais. Then the trials, the last of which is always a personal value to them, and finally they present us their sigil, which we use to empower the altar. After we have won over all 4 Luminaries, the Crow, who introduced herself as Ulfsild's familiar and caretaker of the Scholarium, reveals that she is also, in fact, the 5th and final Luminary. The Crow is the youngest by far, created by Ulfsild just before she was forced to abandon the Scholarium. Referring back to the timeline, that would be in the 22nd century of the First Era, or early 23rd century, since we know Shalidor lost Eyevea to Sheo sometime in the 23rd century. The Crow is, essentially, the product of Ulfsild pretty literally cutting off a piece of her soul and leaving it behind. She loved the Scholarium, the art of scribing, and most of all the Luminaries who had become her family. As one of our final tests, we have to take a vow to protect the Luminaries, among other things. Ulfsild won't let us proceed unless we promise. She loves them too much. As her test, the Crow sends us to her version of the Labyrinthian. We solve a fire puzzle, fight our way through the maze, and defeat the baddie at the end, and, at long last, claim the final sigil which we take to the Scribing Altar. And with that, scribing is fully unlocked, along with all functions of the Scholarium, including all of the lore books that appear at various stages of the quests. 4 of those books, called Our Story 1 through 4, describe the relationship between Ulfsild and Shalidor, and they reveal that the history of the Scholarium is as much a story about a marriage falling apart as it is a story about magic. Ulfsild was the daughter of a Nord woman and a Breachman Briarheart. She was literally born in a hagraven's nest and was rescued by Nords and raised with them, though she was always a bit other. For example, she understood the speech of birds and spoke with them even as a child. This unusual heritage probably contributed to her gift of seeing magic in the world. And here I thought my childhood was weird. Ulfsild was far younger than Shalidor when they met, but she had already acquired the epithets Warrior Witch of Kyne's Aegis, the Pales Priestess of Junal, and the Clever Woman of the Druidoc Mountains. Shalidor arrived in the area to find and consult with 3 different women bearing those titles, only to find that it was one singular and extraordinary woman, Ulfsild. The 2 spent the winter together in Ulfsild's hut, studying, discussing magic theory, and comparing notes. Ulfsild is clear that it was not, at first, a romantic relationship, purely an intellectual one. When the spring came, Shalidor made to leave, but told Ulfsild he wanted to share the secret of immortality with her so that she could live forever too, traveling with him and being his companion. Ulfsild was more than a little heartbroken that after spending so much time in close discussion, that he would understand her so little as to think that she would give up the seasons of her life. No, Ulfsild wished to enjoy a rich life, passing through each stage until the end, and then accepting that end with grace. The idea was an anathema to Shalidor, who very much wanted to live forever, and so they parted ways, clearly incompatible as partners. However, Part 3 of Ulfsild's Our Story ends with her plans to portal to Eyevea to find Shalidor because she has so missed his companionship and intellectual discourse. In Part 4, she arrives only to be told by a caretaker that Shal has left to visit a friend who lives in Skyrim. This obviously means Ulfsild because when she goes to his library, she sees her name on unsent letters, in the margins of ritual notes, and more. She knows he will see the same when he gets to her home, his name scrawled on 100 messages he wasn't there to hear, and so she settles in to wait for him to return home. To her. I'm sure it was an adorable rom-com moment when he arrived back home, dejected and lonely, only to find Ulfsild sitting in his study. If only their story could stop there. If you've never heard of Ulfsild and you want to scoff at the idea that she could be so cool and yet so unknown, this is probably a good spot to point out that it does actually track, because she happens to be standing next to one of the biggest glory hounds Nirn has ever known, and it would be hard to hear or see anyone over Shalidor shouting. Does that sound harsh? Let's take a look at this bit of dialogue from his ghost during the Mages Guild quest.
I laid powerful enchantments on my final resting place. When my legacy is threatened, I'm drawn back from Aetherius.
Listen to the wording of that, y'all. He set up a spell to drag his ghostly ass back to Nirn if his legacy was threatened. Not if Nirn was threatened. Not if all the world's libraries were being destroyed. Not if the structure of reality was under attack. Not if Dagon or Baal captured all the mages, certainly not if the Empire fell, not if all the sweet rolls disappeared. He's literally saying that if people ever begin to forget how awesome he was, his spirit comes back to Nirn to shout about it all over again. Dude. And what was his legacy? What exactly is Shalidor most well known for? The Labyrinthian. Scholarium wanted to change the world, so he democratized literacy, shared books with everyone. Ulfsild wanted to change the world, so she created not one but 2 user interfaces for magic to share her natural gift with the world. Shalidor wanted to change the world, so he built a death trap to challenge anyone who dared think they were as cool as him, thus restricting the education of mages and their average lifespan as a demographic. In a world that contains Mannimarco, Shalidor may not be the actual worst, but he is not the best. So obviously I'm no fan of Shal's. However, to be fair, by her own admission, Ulfsild violated Shalidor's trust in a huge way, and it's important that we talk about that. In Ulfsild's log, the Indrik, she describes meeting the Indrik, the first of the Luminaries that she encountered, and how she made a deal with him to learn about magic. She also admits in her writing that this pact was a direct violation of a promise she and Shalidor had made to each other. They had agreed to never make pacts with otherworldly beings. We might want to hand-wave the scope of this violation because we like the Luminaries and we think of them as good guys. It isn't like making a pact with Moloch Baal, right? But that is not fair to Shalidor. When Shalidor and Ulfsild made that promise, it was partly from a simple safety aspect. A mistake with a being like that can get you killed or worse. But also, when powerful people make those kinds of deals, it rarely impacts only them. Shalidor and Ulfsild were promising to protect each other from the fallout of those kinds of pacts. As a random example, let's take a look at our friends Laramil and Gadain. Laramil had a simple, sustainable deal with Mora. Gadain liked Laramil, kept hanging around her, got more and more entangled in Mora's nonsense. Consequently, Laramil got in deep debt with Mora. Now, because of his relationship with Laramil, whether Gadain likes it or not, the rest of his life, he will be subject to Mora's whims. Fallout is exactly how Shalidor's deal with Sheogorath impacted Ulfsild. But Ulfsild was the one who broke that vow first. Yeah, the Luminaries do appear to be good guys. But once she started that relationship, Ulfsild became, again by her own admission, pretty obsessed with them. Heck, even before she found the Indrik, on probably one of the first romantic trips she took with Shalidor, Ulfsild saw an Indrik, then backtracked to go get that first fable, which she then began studying, probably while still on that trip. Ulfsild describes her attempts to get Shalidor involved, and he didn't seem interested. But it's also possible, maybe even likely, that he was really hurt. As Shalidor and Ulfsild drifted apart, the Luminaries became, more and more, Ulfsild's research partners, friends, and even family. Flip it around. As the Luminaries became Ulfsild's research partners, friends, and even family, she and Shalidor drifted apart. Which was cause, and which was effect. Remember, Shalidor and Ulfsild didn't start out with a physical relationship. He sought her out again because he missed her company, and she his. But the more she dove into scribing, the more she spent that kind of time with them instead of him. We could tell this story and say, and then Sheogorath showed up. But Sheogorath is a metaphor. Another way to phrase it is to say that Shalidor went a little mad. He saw something shiny that represented, to him, something he didn't have but desperately needed. Needed so badly, he gambled away his most prized possession, and by pure coincidence, the Scholarium where Ulfsild's friends lived. I think we can agree the book Sheo offered was not going to fill that void in Shalidor's heart or life, but the whole thing about crazy is that it does not make sense from the outside. So, probably, Shalidor was crazy jealous. But was he jealous because Ulfsild's accomplishments were about to outstrip his? Did he make that bet with Sheo as a Hail Mary attempt to do something cooler than her? There is plenty of ego evidence to support that possibility, sure. But it is also possible that he was jealous of the Luminaries for taking away probably the only person he ever saw as a real friend, and so rare for him, an actual equal. Most likely, it's a combination of the two kinds of crazy, and it's up to you to decide how charitable you feel for him on any average day. On the whole, I gotta say I support Ulfsild's choices more than Shal's, but despite her promise, she did make not one, but 4 deals with 4 different otherworldly entities. Those pacts became the obsession of her life for millennia, gave rise to the creation of scribing, and probably broke Shalidor's heart. In the end, he made a bargain that consequently made it impossible for Ulfsild to continue her work with the Luminaries, and she was forced to lock them up to save them, and then flee herself. Then, she and Shalidor divorced. So, who are the Luminaries? Let's start with the things we know for sure. I'll do some speculating later. As a child, Ulfsild was caught by a herd of stampeding mammoths, and she was saved by the Indrik. She found a feather from his pelt clutched in her hand afterwards, and she could tell it was made of magic. Ulfsild kept that feather and wore it in her hat for the rest of her life, so it's clear the event had a big impact on her. But it happened so young that she forgot the details of the story until she saw a mundane Indrik for the first time while on Somerset with Shalidor. At that point, she insisted they return to a bookshop in Sunhold where she had seen a faded children's fable about an Indrik and a hunter. Her gift told her magic was bound into the story. She wanted to study it. If she was traveling with Shalidor, then this has to have happened after Ulfsild moved to Eyevea, but it's the first time he took her to Somerset, so it also has to be early in their romance. Ulfsild tracked down all of the versions of the Indrik fable that she could find, followed the traces of him through the world, broke the wards, got the keys, found the door, met the Indrik, and proved herself. He then agreed to share his knowledge and power with her, and he tells us explicitly that Ulfsild convinced him to bind his realm to the Scholarium. Which begs some questions. If Ulfsild had to find books, track down the keys and doors, and convince the Indrik to bind his realm to the Scholarium, and that happened after Ulfsild moved to Eyevea, then what were those masses of magic shining like the sun in the old ruins that she found under Eyevea the first time she poured it in? Also, we could ask ourselves why in the world a truly immortal being would tie itself to a little patch of real estate because a mortal asked it to. The mortal is, by definition, going to die, and the immortal being is still going to be stuck there. Why would the Indrik have agreed to that? And not just him, but the others? Canon doesn't answer those questions, and speculation comes later, so on we go. The next thing we know for certain is from Ulfsild's log, The Gryphon and the Fox. Ulfsild was arranging books in the Scholarium when she saw a fox steal a shiny paperweight from her desk. She chased the fox, sliding around corners on the marble floor at breakneck speed until she slid into a wall. But instead of crashing, she found herself going through it and into the Gryphon's realm. Notably, Ulfsild makes a comment about how the chase reminds her of chasing a fox as a child after it stole a basket of treats she was carrying, so this story again links Ulfsild's childhood memories to her adult encounters with the Luminaries. However, despite that Ulfsild's log ends with a description of falling asleep curled up next to the Gryphon, we also have the annotated fable that she then used to track down his keys and then his doorway. Then, presumably, she also convinced him to bind his realm permanently to the Scholarium. Again, so many questions. Going back to the first encounter with Fox, since Fox has the ability to create portals, it's possible he just made a portal back to the Gryphon's realm and Ulfsild was moving so fast she followed. But the Fox's portals are obvious, and usually Ulfsild can literally see magic, so the entrance has to have been deliberately concealed or she would have known it was there. Moreover, that entrance obviously didn't work again, or she wouldn't have had to find the fables and the wards and the keys in the doorway. I find it weird that Ulfsild had to look all over for clues to hunt down a being that she originally found on her doorstep, so to speak. The questions are really piling up, aren't they? We know Ulfsild meets the Netch third because in her log The Netch, she wrote that when the Netch started playing games with her, at first she thought it was the Fox. In the log, Ulfsild described being led down the corridors of the Scholarium by a floating book, and when she passed through a final doorway, instead of entering that room, she instead walked into the realm of the Netch. She described the room she thought she was entering as one of the distant studies, a room which we'd had built. So the doorway that took her to the Netch's realm connected to a room that was not part of the original ruins, but construction that Ulfsild added. While Ulfsild doesn't mention any childhood memories of Netch encounters, she does describe the Netch's energy as childlike joy, and the log ends with her asking the Netch, "What do you want to play?" Since Ulfsild also described doing the fable and key chase with the Netch, maybe the game it chose was hide and seek. Whatever the reason, it appears it went out of its way to deliberately engage her and get her to chase it. The dragon is different because she does not initiate contact with Ulfsild like the others do. In Ulfsild's log, The Dragon, she described the moment when she became aware of the dragon's presence. She and Shalidor were traveling in a Khajiit caravan. One of the storytellers shared a fable, Misbia and the Dragon. Ulfsild wrote, "Just listening, I knew there was a layer deeper than the riddles in the story. I could almost see it. If only I had it committed to a page somehow. I'd pore over the words until the solution took shape before me." So she got up in the middle of the night, left Shalidor in his sleep, and went to find someone to retell the story to her so that she could write it down. She amassed as many versions of the story as she could find, pored over the clues, found the wards, the key fragments. I really am on Ulfsild's side here, but if you're tired of hearing me say that, imagine how Shalidor felt. I've disliked him since Arena, so the fact that I feel even a little bad for that D-bag is why this story is so brilliant. Perspective is everything, right? Regardless, by the time she is chasing the dragon, Ulfsild's notes contain a dry assessment of her relationship with Shalidor. Misbia asks, "What dies by devouring itself?" Ulfsild annotates, "I'd have guessed a candle, or more grimly, a marriage." Eventually, Ulfsild succeeded at the dragon's trial, and the dragon's doorway and statue would have been constructed after that point. We can say pretty confidently that the main hall of the Scholarium did not look like this when Ulfsild arrived. The doorways, statue, and ink channels were all apparently built by her. However, we don't know when she started construction on the Scholarium, or how long she chased the Luminaries, or when exactly it was after she met them that she really solidified all of the magical ritual and enchantment logistics for scribing that she would have needed to have nailed down before even building such a complicated ritual space from scratch. By which I mean, this all took some time. So that's a look at the facts we have. Now let's extrapolate a bit and see what we can figure out about the Luminaries. If we want to know the origins of the Luminaries, then timing is important because all entities closely associated with Ithelia were profoundly affected when Mora's spell made everyone forget her. Beings of pure magic have an obvious association with Magnus, as do the Magna Ge, so that alone tells us that there's a solid chance that when Ithelia was forgotten, it created a before and after moment in their lives. Ulfsild described feeling masses of magicka like the sun in the ruins above her when she first ported to Eyevea. If we're assuming those were the Luminaries, either before or after Ithelia disappeared, then they were hanging out in those old ruins before Ulfsild tracked them down. Perhaps they themselves had some kind of connection to it before Mora's spell. The Meridia statue is the first notable sight we encounter when entering the Scholarium with Nalia. I have never seen that statue used decoratively, it's only in shrines. So at some point, whether in Ulfsild's time or before it, this structure was sacred to Meridia or the Magna Ge as a whole. More than just the relatively run-down appearance of this area, I just don't see Ulfsild worshipping Meridia. She says her ability to see magic was a gift from Magnus, and the crow sometimes lightly swears in Magnus's name. But we don't see any indication in Ulfsild's writing that she was a devotee of Meridia or the Magna Ge. She's called the Pale's priestess of Junal, but Junal isn't Meridia. Ulfsild seems deeply reverent of both nature and magic, but not in the coldly intellectual and ruthless way that Meridia would personify. And it was Ithelia who was forgotten, not Meridia, so wouldn't she or the crow have mentioned Meridia if she was a worshipper? Now, Ulfsild may have been a worshipper of Ithelia and then forgot that she was. I'll come back to that idea in a bit. But concerning the Meridia statue in the caverns, I could be wrong, but I believe that area is part of the old ruins. In the Gold Road Zone story, when Ithelia is newly released from her prison and is seriously disoriented, the first place we meet her is when she goes to her old shrine in Ellinglen. If the old ruins under Eyevea were sacred to the Magna Ge, or even Ithelia, then perhaps the Luminaries fled to that location after Mora's spell for the same reason, because the residual energy felt like home. With the Ithelia storyline looming in the background, the fact that the Luminaries don't know their origins takes on a different light. As we meet each luminary, we ask, "Where did you come from?" And each of them gives us a different answer. We come to understand that not only do they not agree, it is actually a point of contention. In her challenge with the dragon, Ulfsild asks a riddle she knows has no answer. What is the origin of the Luminaries? As a result, Ulfsild's 4 friends got into such a long and heated argument about the question that it broke her heart. Even though it meant starting over and possibly failing, Ulfsild retracted her riddle to stop them from arguing. It's a quest for us, but to her that was a risky decision, so we know it had to be a terrible argument. Which is weird, right? Why does that question touch such a nerve? Well, we've done the Ithelia storyline together, you and I, and we learned that when a big chunk of information is pulled out of someone's memory and deleted, it can cause that person extreme distress. I think it's pretty clear that's what happened to the Luminaries before they were Luminaries. Someone took their memories of their origins and their purpose. One of the questions I raised earlier was why 4 immortal beings would be willing to tie themselves to a physical location on Nirn. And in relative terms, it was like 15 minutes later when the worst-case scenario happened, and oh look, now we live in the Shivering Isles. Ulfsild did everything she could to protect them, including splitting herself in half, but then the Ulfsild half of her fled and left them behind. Quite obviously, they were unable to leave. It's so short-sighted that their willingness to do it seems to indicate some deep-seated need to belong somewhere, to serve a purpose. And who else do we know who is tormented by a lack of purpose?
I don't even know where I originally came from. A part of my past is missing, a part of me, and I won't rest until I recover it.
And where else have we been lately, where ink is a magical substance and fable has a magical meaning?
You interrupt my search?
Thoat Replicanum in the Infinite Archive was transformed into living ink when Mora cast the spell that made everyone forget Ithelia. Given that Mora's sphere of influence includes books, it makes sense that some of Ithelia's more powerful Daedra would turn into stories in books. When Ithelia is remembered during the Necrom Zone story, that is enough to partially revive Thoat, who was then able to leap out of the books in her own previous form and in the form of the beings who were characters in the books. That's what the Fabled are, Thoat's vivified ink shaped into the form of the Mora cultists whose journals were in the archive. But it seems like the Luminaries did not need for Ithelia to be free in order to free themselves from the pages of their fables and take action in the world. If they were associated with Ithelia and they were trapped in fables when Mora cast his spell, like Thoat was, then they would have had to have been considerably more powerful than Thoat. All those assumptions seem relatively tidy, but we have a huge wrinkle: the Scribing Altar itself. In the last paragraph of Ulfsild's book, How to Scribe, she wrote, "If you'll excuse some tired humor, all you have to do is build a locus of power, convince creatures of pure magic that you mean well, etc., etc." Ulfsild definitely created the first Scribing Altar, but did she build the physical altar from scratch, or did she repurpose an old altar she found in the ruins? The reason I'm asking is the same reason the timeline was important, which is the wings. The 8 sets of little wings, one for each of the Magna Ge, plus the larger one in the center for the Prime Archon. Did you see them right away? Because it took me weeks. I think we have to assume this altar was built before Ithelia's imprisonment, because afterwards no crafter would have included the larger 9th set of wings. The Mehrunes Dagon tapestry we looked at in a previous video is an example of that. He's shown with the 8 Magna Ge in this design, and there's no 9th lead figure depicted because no one remembered Ithelia when it was made. Knowing the full origin of the altar would tell us a lot about the origin of the Luminaries. I was set on the idea that Ulfsild repurposed the altar that was present in the old shrine, and she may have done that. But whether she built it or not, she did name it. Why not call it a scribing table, or scribing apparatus, or like the scribe-o-matic? Why call it an altar, a holy word? She called the Luminaries her friends and family, but she never spoke of worshipping them. It doesn't seem likely that it was meant to be an altar to them. So it seems like we have to assume she called it an altar because the magic just intuitively felt sacred to her somehow, or because she originally built it to be an altar and then forgot. And after all, what is scribing if not changing the path of the magic to something it might have been before it was locked into a spell formula? Whatever you believe about Ulfsild and the Luminaries, I think a connection between them and Ithelia is undeniable, but that doesn't mean that they are from Mirrormore. We know from the books The Nine Coruscations Part 1 and 2 that there are 9 Magna Ge, 8 plus the Prime Archon. Meridia, called Meridnunda in the text, is one of the 8. So, where are the other 7? It's clear that in Ithelia's absence, Meridia becomes the most powerful of the Magna Ge simply by virtue of the fact that she has shrines, followers, is the source of power for the Templar class skills, and has been a presence in most of the Elder Scrolls game. We know her name. The others? Not so much. So could the Luminaries be 4 of the missing members of the Magna Ge? I'm inclined to believe no. I don't see why they would be transformed like that. They each have power of their own, even if Ithelia was their White Star. Besides, while Ulfsild and the Crow tell us again and again how powerful the Luminaries are, not only did she not let Gryphon fight Sheogorath for Eyevea, the possibility of all 4 Luminaries standing against him together never came up either. The other Magna Ge may not be as powerful as Meridia, but if Meridia can move against Molag Bal with confidence, then surely 4 of the other Magna Ge working together could have defended a spit of land against Sheo, or broken their half of Eyevea off and taken it somewhere, or something. The fact that collective resistance wasn't on the table makes me think they can't be the other Magna Ge. It also doesn't make sense to me that only 4 of the Magna Ge would be here as Luminaries. Of course, if you're betting against me on this, you might be telling the screen right now that there is, after all, a 5th Luminary, and perhaps Ulfsild would not have been able to create the Crow if there had not been another spirit entity hanging around waiting for a new purpose and form. In that case, we are only missing 2 of the Magna Ge who are bound to turn up in next year's chapter, yes? If you think they were the Magna Ge, I cannot deny you have ground to stand on. We do have a couple of other theories, though, so let's return to Fargrave. And let's ask ourselves again, why are there skeletons in Fargrave? Daedra don't leave skeletons behind. Oblivion is not a physical place. Everything here is a metaphor. Mortals go crazy without sensory input, so your brain just translates all that stimuli into something that will keep you sane and functioning. Mental and magical impressions become sights and sounds, hot and cold. Fargrave is in mourning, eternally. Your psyche senses this and conveys it, and we see a desolate graveland. More than that, though, we see those skeletons. Always at least 1, but never more than 4 at a time. My theory from day one has been that there are exactly 4 of those skeletons, and no matter how many you might count as you cross the city, it's always the same 4 you are seeing. No matter where you go, there they are. Fargrave, and therefore your mind, can't let you forget them. That was how I first decided that although the celestial palanquin could have had any number of bearers, the number had been 4. Beings of tremendous power are missing from Fargrave. They are not in torpor, as Thoat was, nor wandering like Torvasard and Vargas. They are forever lost to Fargrave, and they have been for as long as anyone remembers. The space that contained them, the purpose they served, can never be filled by others. We feel the evidence of their former existence and interpret that sense of once and nevermore as skeletons. At the end of the Gold Road Zone story, when we travel to the loom of the untraveled path, we see those 4 skeletons circling the loom. They were turning into crystal at that point, but they were still skeletons. They didn't rise to defend their prince as she fought for her life. They were supposed to be there. We could feel the empty spaces where they should have been. Vargas and Torvasard were there. The bearers, however, were absent. The bearers of Fargrave were created by Ithelia to convey her from one path to another, one destination to another, one goal to another. Their divine purpose was to work together to carry another forward on a metaphorical journey. Broken violently from their yoke by Mora, but too powerful to disappear, my personal theory is that they each found refuge in a story and recreated themselves as those respective characters, just as Thoat did, but with way more agency and control. And as they coalesced into those identities, forever leaving behind their former roles, the four skeletons of Fargrave settled heavy onto the sands. Fundamentally different sorts of beings than Torvasard, Vargas, or Thoat, the bearers as Fable still had enough power to move from the pages of their new realms to Nirn whenever they wanted. After all, Ithelia and her Daedra aren't bound by the Cold Harbor Compact, and if they had indeed been the bearers, then moving from plane to plane was literally what they were made to do. But since they didn't remember Miramore, or Ithelia, when they manifested, they didn't look like Shardborn. The first luminary Ulfsild met was the Indrik, and his first act was to take her onto his back and carry her away from danger. Or some version of the Indrik. If we go back to Ulfsild's stories, she had the encounter as a child and ended up with the feather, but even though she carried that feather for the rest of her life, paradoxically she admits that she quickly forgot the details of the being that she got the feather from. Then, much later, as an adult, Ulfsild and Shalidor were traveling and she saw the fable in a bookshop. She noted magic in the text but didn't think much about it. After that, she saw the mundane Indrik and then she remembered, or you might say retroactively filled in the details for, the event that happened to her as a child. Then she went back and bought the fable. The entity Ulfsild met as a child for certain had feathers, but based on that first paragraph of the Indrik's log, that entity was almost certainly not an Indrik. And that mental rewriting gives us a way to make sense of the paradoxical circular logic relationship between Ulfsild and the Luminaries. All the Luminaries have wings, right? Maybe it wasn't just a play on the architectural meaning of a wing. It seems possible Ulfsild met them before they were fables, and whatever they were back then, they had wings. And wings are a thing with Ulfsild. She herself was a magical being, remember, half Briarheart and born in a hagraven's nest. She could talk to birds and see magic. That powerful magical child about to be trampled by stampeding mammoths was saved by an otherworldly being. Did she instinctively summon him in a burst of desperate magic? Was she speaking bird language? Was he already watching her? Either way, once the Indrik was aware of her, the others would have been too. So it does seem possible that Ulfsild knew them in their previous forms, but then they had to be reintroduced after Ithelia disappeared, though that took years of searching on Ulfsild's part. Even the obsession and the searching makes more sense if we assume her personal memories were taken and she was searching to fill that void. Certainly it's true that while searching, Ulfsild developed opinions about them, even emotions. We see how she meets 3 of them for the first time, quote-unquote, and it's clear she thought of them as friends before she entered their doorways as luminaries. And this is where I point out that the will of a powerful mage shapes magic, particularly if that will is fueled by strong emotion. The luminaries are beings of pure magic. And if they were reformed when Mora's spell hit, Ulfsild's will might have had more of an impact than it would have otherwise. In addition to being oddly fond of her in a way that seems beyond the limited emotional range of most otherworldly beings, the luminaries all seem particularly well suited to her personality and needs, do they not? And surprisingly willing to link their realms permanently to the Scholarium, I'll mention again. It really sounded so crazy at first, but if they were desperate for a purpose, and partially molded by Ulfsild's expectations as they firmed into their new forms, and if they were used to being bound to a place, it starts to make a lot of sense. If the luminaries had been the bearers of the celestial palanquin, one might ask why they didn't return to those roles when Ithelia returned. Perhaps it was because they linked their realms to the Scholarium that they could no longer return to Fargrave. Maybe it was because Ulfsild's will helped solidify their new identities. At the very least, it seems she gave them purpose and a new mistress to serve. Until Zos tells us the details, hopefully that they will, I believe Ulfsild is at least part of the reason that those giant skeletons sit on the sands of Fargrave. You'll have to decide for yourself if you agree. We are at the wrap-up, and as I close, I'm going to pan out a little, so to speak. The current character tutorial I mentioned earlier came with the Somerset update, which was part of the Daedric War storyline involving Somerset, the Clockwork City DLC before it, and before that, Vardenfell. The Clockwork City storyline ends with Sothasil talking to us about our role as the prisoner and how we can escape the cage of reality, but he cannot. Zos has proven they're not only willing to cede story points over years before a reveal, but also that they're great at it. Sothasil reminded us that we are the prisoner, and the book The Nine Coruscations Part 1 specifically tells us that the prisoner acts as the will of the Prime Archon. The prisoner has been pulling down towers in the solo games for a long time. The rumors that we've heard about Elder Scrolls 6 suggest that the plot will focus on the Durrani Tower, and very well might involve the Magna Ge. Do the Magna Ge and Mehrunes Dagon destroy the world? Are we headed to a cataclysm and a full reality reset? The birth of the next Kalpa, maybe? I don't know where all this is going, but I'll put down gold now that the next year's chapter, the capstone to the 10th anniversary, is going to be crazy good. I couldn't help but notice that Meridia was absent from the Westweald story, and I'd love to see her next June. I'll bet she has opinions about this if she remembers it. It would be a great callback since she was part of the original Cold Harbor quest. I wonder if Meridia does show up, if she'll still be a good guy. So what do you think? Too much? Too big a leap? Whether you agree with my crazy theories or not, I appreciate that you hung around. I'm guessing if you're still here, you have opinions, and given the amount of leaping from assumption to assumption that I just did, I would love to hear them. If you enjoyed yourself, would like to support the channel, and you're active on social media, I'd love it if you'd share the video link with the hashtag ESO and hashtag lore, and tag Zos at the Elder Scrolls Online. Those tags will do the best job of getting this video on the screens of people who care about the lore. I know I can't be 100% right, and I genuinely love to have a conversation about where everyone thinks this is going, so it really isn't just about channel promotion. I want to hear what the lore community has to say. Regardless, I appreciate that you spent this time with me today and that you listened to the end. I really have been looking forward to covering this material, and I am thrilled about every single person who finds it interesting enough to hang out with me while I babble about every damn detail. You're awesome. Thank you. We still have more to cover, including Ayleid history and the recollection, and the Good Daedra. The next lore video in the Ithelia series will be neither of those, however, so we've got at least 3 more. And that's a wrap. Thanks for watching, and until next time, may all your loots be leet.
But what's a life without unanswered questions, right? Boring, if you ask me.